Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you. And thanks also, Jason, for this co-creation. So, community as a political and historical project for me means recognizing that building and maintaining community means doing so in the midst of ecological collapse, growing and extreme inequality, rising authoritarianism and fascism, and neo-colonial campaigns like the Gaza genocide, but also many other situations of colonial brutality, as in Kurdistan, as in Sudan, as in Congo, and so many places in the geopolitical south. And I think it is important to realize that those aren't separate crises, but culminations of 500 years of capitalism / modernity / coloniality, and of 5,000 years of a patriarchal dominated culture. These crises result from a logic inbuilt in this system which drives ever-growing accumulation through violent extraction and dispossession. And we are already seeing the consequences, right? The planet becomes more and more uninhabitable, more and more people forced to flee the places that they live in, housing becoming unaffordable, extreme weather events disrupting food production, making food more scarce and more expensive, and basically making the difference between those with capital and those without capital ever more stark. And the question is, how do we respond to a world in collapse? And there are two very distinct visions emerging for this. One is that Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor termed as end times fascism, which is based on the idea or the mentality that as the world is collapsing, as the world is ending, let's barricade ourselves and those we consider like-minded and consider saving in survivable islands of privilege. And this is happening already. Billionaires building gated communities, fortressed states of privilege, billionaire bunkers and fantasies of escaping to Mars. It's a politics of escape, the escape of the rich from the poor, from those fleeing colonialism, and ultimately fleeing from responsibility for their actions. And I don't think that this logic will stop at bunkers. I think we will also see regenerative communities, perhaps even ecovillages, created by billionaires inside fortresses policed by private militias. But also something different is emerging. And that is meeting collapse, not with escape, but with radical solidarity. Not by retreating from one another, but by deepening our capacity to stick together. Not by protecting privilege, but by collectivizing care, resources, and responsibility. That in my view, is the political task of intentional communities and ecovillages at this time. And whether we move towards futures of fascism or futures of collective liberation depends on a number of conditions. One is whether an alternative, regenerative, post-capitalist infrastructure becomes available at scale before it is too late. But it is also a question of alternatives for whom? Who has access to those spaces? Who has agency in them? And here I think it is also, when we ask about the political task of community, it's a question that I want all of us to ask ourselves and to have this self-assessment of to what extent do our communities actually serve collective liberation, and to what extent are they in some ways also islands of privilege, even if not intentionally.
Jason, you. Yeah, when you listen to Martin and you work on alternatives, you have experiences, but would you say that these are actually growing? And are they really capable of offering us an alternative to the dominant market system? I mean, do you see any light at the end of the tunnel?
No. No, I'm joking. Of course, yes. Yes. But not because they're already there and perfect, and not because they are fully formed, and not because they're scaled at the right level as we would need, not because they're risk-free or guaranteed, but they are already happening. They're there. And frankly, if we do not embrace them, the world would be a really, really worse place. So I will not bore you with numbers and formulas and budgets and predictions, because fortunately I'm not an economist. But I ask you to bear with me because I want to go through a few more things linking to what was just said, of how we get a way, or how we find a way through this painful transition that we're living today, a way that is not escaping, but a way that is really making ourselves responsible for the future that we want. And this is happening in a time when we see everything accelerating. The shift from welfare economy to warfare economy, where war is normalized, violence is normalized, fear is being normalized. And the economy of the rich and the powerful, these oligarchs, these new kings, they have lost their mask. We can see them. It is, but the fact is that they are less and less capable of imposing this dominant system without force, without control, without violence. And this is not a sign of strength. It is the sign of the ending of an era. And at the same time that an era is ending, something new is coming up, and openings appear. And it is up to us to see these openings and to hack the system so that these openings can allow us to create these alternatives and to multiply them. We have technologies today that can work for us, where we can exchange value, open value, across networks without banks sitting in the middle, without states having to control and govern every movement that we do. And we can organize production in distributed ways, sharing designs, adapting them in ways that the old industrial age era did not even think possible. But even more important, we can rethink what value is itself radically. We can ask ourselves what it means to coordinate not just the means of production and the making of things, but also how we govern them together. We can steward shared resources without needing someone to hold the ledger for us. We can build systems that free people from dependencies, oppression, and all the forms of extraction that still are inside our societies. From self-exploitation, which many of us still do, to post-colonial inequalities, from patriarchal domination, to labor that breaks the body and spirit, and especially steals all of our time. The worst thing that is happening today is that our time is being taken from us. And as Euclides Manse, who is a liberation philosopher from Brazil, says, a new economy is an economy of liberation. And maybe this means that we also need to liberate our language. Because if you even think about it, the word economy, that comes from the Greek oikos and emein, that means the care or the management of the household, today means something totally different. We were introduced saying, today it's about money. No, it's not about money. It's about care of life, care of shared life, and how we can address our needs in a way that doesn't destroy the planet. Today, the economy, what we normally mean by economy is markets, growth, competition, capital accumulation, but that is not normal. Capital accumulation, exploitative, extractive economy is not normal. And yet, this is what we are taught to understand as common sense. Now, here's where I would do a whole excursus on alternative economies, a historical thing, how they came up, where they are in the last 30 years. I'll skip that. I don't even know how much time I have, but what I would like to say that in the last few years, in our networks, and in this case, in the Social Solidarity Economy Network, we've been working on thinking about a strategy, or actually a framework for a strategy, not just for our network, but for a larger movement. And working with other networks like GEN, like ECOLISE, and many others, engaging together. And we came out with a document that you can find on the website, which we think is pretty cool. But the main thing is about repoliticizing social solidarity economy and building collective power and autonomy together. Because economy is not a separate thing from life. And it's not a separate thing from politics. And politics, whether you want it or not, are part of our life. And in these multiple crises that we're facing today, where institutions are captured and we feel that the technologies have taken control, algorithms are controlling the economy, etc., how can we really change the economic system? For many people, especially the young generations, facing precarious work, housing insecurity, and uncertain futures, alternative economies really can offer concrete and political support. Because it's about building your life security through self-organization, through organizing collectively, not depending on someone to organize it for you. And therefore also building the infrastructures that we need and the finance that we need. Because until we depend by a global financial system that has other interests, we cannot create our own real independent economic system.
Thank you, Jason. Collectively, there we go. Back to you, Martin. What do you see as core contradictions of eco-villages in Europe between their political potential and their current realities?
So take a deep breath. Yeah, I want to offer 4 observations, maybe also provocations on contradictions. And I think that contradictions are actually gifts, because when we can really embrace them, that is where evolution continues. So it's nothing negative, but evolutionary. But before I do so, I want to say that I'm speaking from a particular situated context, especially when we touch on issues of inequality, power, privilege. It's important to say that I'm speaking here as a white cis man from a middle class background with a German passport. And that is not to say that it is not to center my experience, but to say actually the opposite. It is just one perspective out of many, and that I'm talking about an experience that many others here will have been much more impacted by than me because of the ways that my identity shields me from many of the impacts of those systems. So the first thing is, the first observation is that ecovillages and intentional communities that do not transform their bioregional contexts lack political relevance. So many intentional communities become sort of isolated from their surroundings by lacking participation in local culture, economies, struggles, and especially when communities are made up in majority of people that are better off socioeconomically than most people in their surrounding, they can contribute to things like cultural colonization, meaning creating an alternative culture that competes with the local one or doesn't integrate, or also rural gentrification where they drive up property prices that makes those regions less affordable for the people already living there. So, but this is not just because of the identity and the backgrounds of people, it is also deeper. So if we have theories of change that make us believe that we will save the world simply by creating eco-villages that are replicable, we might not feel incentivized to actually build relationships with the people around us. But that transversal cooperation I find is absolutely crucial. And I want to be frank here. If 20, 50, or 200 people can figure out how to live with each other well, that is incredibly meaningful. But it doesn't mean that it is a universal answer to all the questions of our times. Eco-villages alone will not save the world. And the fantasy of insular self-sufficiency will collapse with the society it imagines to escape from. If we want resilient food systems, for example, in many places this means contributing to the regeneration of ecosystems and water cycles in that bioregion. It means contributing to local economies and cooperation between different parts of the population. Nothing in nature exists in isolation. Resilience results from cooperation amid diversity. So rather than imagining intentional community as this all-encompassing standalone answer to the question of our times, I wonder how can eco-villages catalyze regenerative transformation in the local, bioregional, cultural, economic, political context that they are part of. And trigger warning, I also say this because I believe that believing ourselves to be superior to the quote-unquote outside world in many cases is the first step to becoming a cult. And I know this is polemic language, and the word has often been weaponized against intentional communities, but I still find it relevant because communities that have this shared higher mission of saving the world and therefore believing that they possess capital T truth can easily create a kind of internal dynamic where members give up on their ethical judgment, and that is the first step to gaslighting, extraction, abuse. And I think as a movement, it is important that we pay more attention to this shadow side of intentional community. The second observation is communal living alone doesn't make you post-capitalist or democratic. So many communities commodify the practice and knowledge of community while reproducing economic inequality inside of them. Access often depends on inherited wealth, savings, or remote work. Increasingly, communities rely on volunteers who actually pay to work inside of these communities without sufficient protections. So under the language of community and gift economy, intentional communities can create deeply unequal and sometimes also extractive arrangements that remain accessible mostly to people with privilege or leave people without privilege in very precarious situations. So I think what really matters here is looking at material realities. Who owns the place? Who makes economic decisions? How are income and wealth distributed? What are the impacts of the ways that we earn money? For example, when they are based on retreats and tourism rather than tending to more essential needs in the territory. So as long as small groups call the shots and structural economic inequality remains intact, it is not post-capitalist. It is just a different label. Third, accessibility is a political question, not a diversity issue. So many or most ecovillages in Europe or in the global north remain predominantly white and middle class. And this is not simply a coincidence. This is the result of material and cultural barriers to entry. So beyond the economic barriers that I just mentioned, for example, black people and people of color often encounter additional barriers, such as microaggressions, tone policing, exclusion from information and decision-making, tokenization, cultural appropriation, spiritual bypassing, white innocence, white fragility. And if you don't know what these terms mean, I encourage you to look them up. And also, too often, people naming those forms of harm become problematized rather than the thing that they are addressing. If people from marginalized backgrounds don't have agency in, can't be well in, or don't even have access to our spaces, they are not radical and revolutionary. They reproduce structures of exclusion that the system that we are trying to overcome is based on. And finally, and I know I'm at time, there is no escape from politics. And I think that, I'm good? Okay, I'm just running through. I think there is a, you guys okay? So I think there is a very dangerous idea in ecovillages, which is the idea that because we live in an alternative communal way, we have already left capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy behind. And that idea is possibly the most depoliticizing idea because it makes us blind to the ways that these patterns still play out inside our spaces. And many people get uncomfortable when pointing towards these contradictions, and the impulse is to rush and to say, yes, okay, but what is the solution? And I want us to actually slow down and to really face turn towards ourselves, look ourselves in the mirror. And I'm not saying we should spend our lives analyzing those systems, or that analysis alone is, makes us immune. But I'm suggesting that the depth of our alternatives in some ways is proportional to our willingness to embrace the contradictions that come along with building them. Because if we are actually trying to overcome dominant systems, it is inevitable that we will be in contradictions because we are between two paradigms, and those are centuries, sometimes millennia old systems. So it is not a failure, it's not a mistake to be in contradiction. The contradictions are inevitable. The question is, what do we do with them? Because if we deny them, we become locked in them, and we might even promote part of our investments as a new culture. But if we actually acknowledge them and work with them, we can transform and evolve towards greater contextual relevance. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Martin. And before I come back to you, Jason, I would just like you to think about that for a minute. I mean, we are all community activists here, or at least most or many of us, and others want to become. And I still believe in community. But it's a very, very relevant questions Martin is asking. And before we continue, just let it resonate for a moment. And having said this, I don't want to be too frustrated. I see these topics and I see the absolute importance, and I really can underline what you've said. I think we all know examples from ourselves, from communities we've visited, but quite likely also from our own communities. And at the same time, I want to see alternatives. And I asked Jason, I asked you before, where are these alternatives? And you said, well, you know, you had a very nice analysis, and you said, yes, they are. But where? Where do I find them? What can I actually do? Can you give us some examples? Yes. Well, he's not starting with no.
Yes, but I also want to recognize that I'm full of contradictions, full of privileges too. What you just said resonates a lot. Some I can clearly see, others I still cannot, others I don't want to see. But that's where I come from, and I'm always trying to uncover what these privileges are and what they mean and what they lead me to. So one question I would like to ask all of you is, do you think you're all already practicing some form of new economy? Raise your hand. Okay, wow. Because, first of all, we have to know what they are, so I'll give you some examples. But before even that, we have to think of something deeper. That is exactly what Martin was saying. That is that we have to unlearn what we think is the only economic system possible. And unlearning is not just an individual exercise, it's a collective exercise. It means asking ourselves how our minds have been shaped by colonial histories, extractive logic, and invisible hierarchies. It means questioning not only what we know, but how we know it, and whose knowledge has been excluded all the way through. Ivan Illich, maybe some of you know about his work, warned us that institutions designed for care, education, and progress can easily reproduce dependence and alienation. And I think this warning matters a lot today, because in order to decolonize our minds, we must confront not only the bad information we have every day from many different sources, but also the habits and assumptions that live inside us. And unlearning alone is not enough, because we're also embedded in material systems, the energy grids, the supply chains crossing the world, digital infrastructures that are deeply entangled with fossil extraction, ecological destruction, social fragmentation, all these systems that make our modern life possible and that shape our relationships. They shape our rhythms of life. They shape what we think is possible. So if we want more just and livable futures, we need to do two things at once. We need to dismantle what is toxic and broken. And that is an activity. It's not a passivity. And we need to cultivate the alternatives rooted in interdependence. So that means rethinking what we produce and how we trade, okay? But it's also how we live together. And ecovillages are an example of this. How we repair the broken social fabric. How we recover trust, which is the theme of this encounter. And how we go beyond the idea of competition but also how we can internalize a different view of what we need. And here I think an ecofeminist perspective is essential. I take Maria Mies and Veronica Bernal-Thompson that use the word subsistence. I don't know if you are aware of this word, to name something very important, that the core of a just society is not growth, profit, or endless accumulation. It is the production of life itself. It's food, it's care, it's all the household domestic work, it's mutual aid, it's the everyday activities that sustain people and the environment in which we're in. Now, capitalist economies systematically devalue this work. They make it invisible. They treat women and nature as commodities to exploit, while presenting production as the real economy. But it is not. And we have to get out of this idea that subsistence is poverty. It is not poverty. Subsistence is not isolation. It is self-reliance. It is autonomy. It is communal control over the means of life. It's reorganizing production and consumption around what people actually need. That means supporting local and bioregional economies. It means repairing rather than replacing. It means strengthening the commons, mutual aid, and cooperative forms of living. And it also means learning how to live with what is ending. Now here I had a whole spiel on hospicing modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, this concept that we can and then should sort of accompany the ending of this violent system in a way that it can that we can let it go, but that we can also imagine what we can keep from it. And it's also not a passive action. It needs an ethical stance. It asks us to make space for grief, for uncertainty, for contradiction. And it also shows us that there are cracks that are emerging in the terrain. And these cracks are important. And now, finally, I will come to what these alternatives may be, right? In the last 2 minutes. So let's look closely at what these real economy alternatives are. And they don't dominate, of course, the headlines. You haven't heard about them on TV, or they are not in the stock market, but they exist. They are persistent, they are rooted, and they are quietly transformative. For instance, there are tons of agroecological cooperatives in Italy and Spain rebuilding food sovereignty from the soil up. So they're reconnecting local chain productions in not only how we produce, but with whom, for whom, and how we distribute. There are community-supported agriculture networks in France and in Poland, so not just the single ones, but how they build networks together. There are solidarity purchasing groups in Italy. There are land trusts reclaiming access to land in Scotland and Portugal. There are community kitchens in Belgium and in the UK that promote food security and dignity in ways that are not charitable. So they're not just charitable kitchens, they are actually involving the people who they're serving. There are renewable energy communities in Germany and Denmark, across Southern and Eastern Europe, where citizens are not just consumers of energy, but co-producers, co-owners, and those who are pushing for a real just transition. And here energy becomes not just a commodity, but a commons. They are worker-owned cooperative factories. I'll talk about this shortly after. There are cooperative housing projects from Vienna to Zurich to Barcelona, where speculation is replaced by long-term affordability and living together becomes a political act of care. There are mutual aid networks, tool libraries, digital commons, there are platform cooperatives and open source communities, freeing technologies. There are solidarity finance initiatives, ethical banks, community currencies, time banks. So we can share time not for money. And rotating saving groups that redefine credit not as extraction or debt, but as trust. Credit is a way to trust one another. And these are not isolated experiments. They are a potential new economic ecosystem when they are linked together. They have many different names and many different ways of doing in every different place, but they share common values. And if we shift our gaze, we begin to see them differently. We can see this mycelium network, like fungi beneath the earth, in the forest floor, connecting, exchanging, nourishing, invisible until we learn how to look. Powerful once we understand how they work together. Are these all perfect models of liberated communities? No. Are they trying? Yes, most of them. And many successfully. So many are even being recognized institutionally. I mean, with our networks, we've been doing a lot of work at the European Union and the UN. So just in the last 4 or 5 years, the UN has recognized social solidarity economy with a resolution. The European Union has an action plan for social economy. Even the ILO, the International Labour Organization, has integrated more cooperative forms of economy in it, and many states have adopted new norms to favor it. But there's still a problem. And that problem is that there's not yet a corresponding public investment in the scale that is needed. Money is going towards security, militarization, war, and is taken out from developing these forms of economy. It's like wanting to cultivate a garden without water. So, of course, we know that alternative economy, social solidarity economy should not become dependent on public funding alone, but with the competition of the market rules today, how can we do it? The private sector externalizes costs and socializes harm while it concentrates profits. We want to do exactly the opposite. We want to socialize the benefits and reinvest any profits into collective care. And the last words, if I have 1 minute? 1 minute. Ecovillages, where do they fit? Just to echo what you were saying in a more positive, maybe way. You have been prototyping futures that others are only beginning to imagine. Integrating food, energy, housing, governance, and culture into coherent place-based systems. You can take that phrase if you want. And you have been practicing commoning in real time, managing resources collectively, making decisions together, holding conflict, building trust, learning how to live with difference and with limits to this, but I'm sure also engaging with that. And this matters because ecovillages can be epicenters of a joyful earthquake that brings new cracks in the earth. Not by us isolating yourselves, not by building utopias apart, but by becoming nodes in a wider territorial and translocal network of other economies. By opening up, by sharing practices, by collaborating with municipalities, social movements, cooperatives, and solidarity economy networks. By engaging with policy without losing autonomy. By scaling through relationships, not just replicating one another. And here, the key word is, again, trust. Because the dominant economic system runs on a very different operating system. It's about competition over cooperation, extraction over regeneration, profit over benefit, and above all, distrust. distrust of others, distrust of communities, distrust of our own collective capacity. So to dare to trust a new economy is not just an economic act. It's a cultural, psychological, political act, and a very patient one.